What we want to discuss a little bit today is a very big issue and a very important one. And that is the idea of how do we transform ourselves in a way that we are no longer living what we'll call from the outside in, but live from the inside out. Or another way to phrase this would be, how do we change our life from living as a slave to a master? Let me give you a simple example of what this means, and then try to unpack this idea. You wake up in the morning, and it's a nice sunny day, and you're on vacation. Do you feel good? Yes. Very good. You wake up in the morning. It's Monday morning. You're back at your job. You have to go to the job today. You wake up in the morning, and it's pouring rain outside, and it's dark. How do you feel? Not so good. Not so good. This is natural. So who decided how you're going to feel about your day? Did you decide? Nope. You actually didn't. You know who decided? The weather. So if you wake up in the morning and the sun is shining, you feel good. Who chose your day? The weather. If you wake up in the morning and it's raining, who chooses your day? The weather. You come to work, and someone walks over to you and says, by the way, you look radiant today. You look so beautiful. And inwardly you smile to yourself and you feel good about yourself. It happens? I don't know if it happens to men, but I'm sure it happens to others. Or someone walks over to you during the day and says, you know, by the way, I didn't realize you're actually so brilliant. Your ideas are amazing. You feel good about yourself. This is the natural, instinctive reaction of the human being, but you know what happens? The reverse. You come to work and someone says, by the way, your outfit is terrible. And you really look ugly. And you know, I thought you're smart, but you're really not that smart. And then you start feeling bad about yourself. So who creates your sense of self-worth? Another person. Someone comes along and says you're smart, you feel good about yourself. Someone comes along and says the opposite, you feel bad about yourself. So how do you define yourself, or how are you creating your image of self, is really not from within yourself, but it's from the exterior. The perception of others about you creates the image of who you are. If some people and enough people come along and say you're smart, if as a child your parents kept on telling you that you're a very smart child, then you probably think you're smart. Then when you come to school and you don't get such good marks, you wonder why. But this is what the image is created. If someone from a young age kept on pushing you down and telling you that you're not worth anything and you're lazy and you don't have discipline, and they tell you this constantly, someone tells you this, what happens is that this creates the image of self. So this is the difference between a person that is choosing how they're going to live versus a person whose life is already chosen for them. Because your reactions and your perceptions and your definitions of yourself is not created from the inside out, but it's created from the outside in. This is one important thing that we have to understand. And if we could somehow change this perception, that instead of being completely dependent on the impressions of others, for better or for worse, because it has to work both ways. We can't say that we're just going to take compliments and we're not going to take insults, because it works both ways. If you're impressed both ways. So how do we change ourselves in a way that we become masters of our own existence and we live from the inside out, and we choose our responses, and we choose the way we want to live. You're following? This is the issue that we have to understand. This is one important thing. The next important thing, which we're going to try to unpack, is this idea of change. And when we talk about change, let's give a very simple example. Let's say someone decides that they're not going to eat cake anymore. They need to go on a diet, and they decide that they don't want to eat any more cake. You don't have to raise your hand if this happened to you, but I'm sure at some point in your life you made such a resolution that you're not going to eat this or not going to eat that, not going to be this or not going to do that. Right? We all do this. So one day, maybe your birthday, you sit down and you think about your life and you say, these are the things that I want to change about myself. This is a very simple resolution. I am going to no longer eat cake. Why? Because the sugar is not good for me, and I don't need these extra pounds, and I never need this. Instead of eating cake, I'm going to eat a piece of chocolate after a meal, and everything's going to be fine. Okay. So this happens Sunday evening. Sunday evening, you made this resolution. Sunday night, there's dinner, you're served a piece of cake, and you say, nope, I just made a resolution, I'm not going to eat cake because it's not good for me. And the cake is put back into the fridge. Somehow, at 12 o'clock at night, you find yourself in the kitchen, in front of the piece of cake, eating it. Okay, so this doesn't happen Sunday night. Let's say it happens Monday night or Tuesday night. But a few days later, not too much after you made this very strong resolution that you're not going to eat it, you find yourself in the midst of eating a piece of cake. You're familiar with this phenomenon? And then you ask yourself, what am I, a hypocrite? What's wrong with me? I just made a resolution yesterday, 5 minutes ago. I'm not going to do this. I understand it's not good for me. So what you tell yourself is, okay, I slipped one time. I'm never going to do it again. I promise. I'm never going to eat cake again. This happens Sunday evening. Monday morning, for breakfast, before you realize you're eating your croissant. So you justify it. It's not really a piece of cake. But in the afternoon, you find yourself again. Do you understand this repetitive behavior? Basically, we make resolutions to change, but we never do. That's the honest truth. We make resolutions, we're going to swear off, we're going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're going to do the other thing. We do it for a day, 2 days, and all resolutions are broken. Why? What's wrong with us? There's nothing really wrong with you or with us. There's just there's an internal argument that occurs. And this argument occurs between what we'll call the left part of the brain and the right part of the brain. Or if you wish, you can call it your conscious or your subconscious. There's a certain part of the logical mind that makes choices and says, this thing is not good for me, I'm not going to do it any longer. And you understand logically how it doesn't make sense for you to continually eat the cake. Okay, it's logic. However, most of your choices, I would even say 99% of your choices, is not created from an objective, logical place. The reason why we do things, mostly, is because these are subconscious reactive behaviors. Somehow, over the course of time, we've associated, for example, we're using this a piece of cake, for example, we've associated eating cake with maybe a comfort food, makes us feel good, maybe it reminds us of our birthday, maybe it reminds us how our parents bought us a cake when we were 5 years old or something. Somehow there's an association with cake that gives us comfort. When we're faced with a conscious choice, meaning we're thinking what we should and should not do, so our logical mind, which we'll say is the left part of the brain, dictates and says, this is not good for you any longer, stop doing it. But most times we're not acting from a logical place. Most time we're acting from an instinctive place. And our instincts, created through millions of impressions throughout our life, through various different stimuli and sensations throughout life, immediately associates this piece of cake in the mind on a very deep level with something that we need, and therefore we go ahead and we eat it. This is what's going on. And so we're not hypocrites. It's not like the rational mind chooses one thing, and the next day the rational mind chooses something else. That would be hypocritical. It's because they're actually deeper parts of self that draw us to these things that we rationally say, okay, I'm not going to smoke, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, and rationally it makes sense to me, and I 100% agree that I shouldn't be doing it. But I keep on going back to these behaviors because this is something that's not rational. You following? This is the problem. Now the question is, if this is the problem, how do we undo this problem? Because to talk about and say, let's say I'm going to talk about anger. I'm going to give you a lecture for 2 hours how anger is the most destructive thing in the universe. It destroys you, it destroys other people, it destroys relationships. Don't become angry. And everyone's going to shake their head and say, yes, angry, I'll never become angry again. You know what's going to happen? Nothing. You'll be inspired for 5 minutes. You're going to say you're not going to be angry. The other person's going to say, did you hear the lecture? And one person will say, I heard this thing. The other person said, I heard something else. And then you start fighting, and then you're angry at the other person. You're angry at what you heard. Why? Because these are very deeply seated emotions. And in order to really change, if you want to change, we have to change on a very deep subconscious level. So there's basically, what we'll say is there's a tension, an unresolved tension between our left conscious mind and our right subconscious mind, or between the world of the word, which is intellect, and the world of the image. And we are going to try to understand how, if we really want to change anything, and everyone has some particular trait that they have to deal with, if we really want to change, how do we change ourselves in such a way that we're not just changing external behavior and resolving not to do this or to do the other thing, because as we know, it doesn't work. How do we change ourselves in a way that we really transform the self, not the act, but the doer? How do we transform the doer? How do we transform ourselves, and therefore our instinctive, reactive emotions and reactive responses to life would be in accordance to what our principles are really at? So set certain principles and say, this is what we want in our life. And then we are going to not only consciously make such choices when we're presented with them, but even when it comes to instinct, our instincts are going to tell us to do the right thing. Okay, this is what we have to understand. So these are two basic issues. You're following? The issue number one is how to stop being affected by other people, that our sense of self-worth and our sense of self, of who we are, whether we feel good about the day or negative about the day, or whether we feel good about ourselves and not so good about ourselves, is because we are choosing that today will be a good day, despite the weather, and we are choosing that we're going to feel good about ourselves and confident about ourselves, despite whether people think we're brilliant or not. Now, there's an interesting story. We're not going to focus on this story too much, but there's an interesting Kabbalistic story. It's a story that's brought down by Yitzchak de Binaku, who was a student of Nachmanides, the Ramban. So he lived somewhere in the 1300s. And he writes that there was once a disciple that decided that he wants to become a student of this great teacher. So he goes to this great teacher, and the teacher asks him a few questions and says, do you know this, do you know that? And he basically does a test. And he sees that on a level of information, the kid is brilliant. He says, I have one final question to ask you, and if you answer the question in the affirmative, I will accept you as my student. He says, have you reached the level of hishtavut? Hishtavut in English is translated as equanimity. So the kid says, I don't know what you're talking about. What does it mean? Like most people in this room. What does it mean? What does equanimity mean? So the master tells him, When someone compliments you, do you feel good about yourself? He says, of course. I'm honest, I do feel good about myself. How about when someone insults you? Do you feel bad about yourself? He says, yes, I do. He says, I don't accept you yet as a student. Go back and reach a place of hishtavut. Hishtavut is a place of perfect equanimity. When you reach a place of perfect equanimity, equanimity from the root word of equal, when you can stay even, equal, both when people are praising you and when people are insulting you, then you have reached a plateau where you are beginning to become a master of your own existence. Because then you're no longer affected by other things, but you are the effect of other things. You're no longer the effect, but you're the cause of your life. Most times we're the effect of life. Incidentally, but we're not going to get into this, the Baal Shem Tov, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, begins one of his books that was written by his students with this concept of shiviti, the same word shaveh, which is equal. And he says this practice of ishtavut should also be practiced with food. Some people drink coffee in the morning. Some people say that they can't function without coffee. And some people have an excuse for being rude because they didn't yet have their coffee. This is the opposite of ishtavut. True ishtavut is that it doesn't make a difference what you eat. Now, I'm telling you very high spiritual levels. But it's a practice, at least an aspiration, and then there's a higher level in that, which is the appreciation of taste that comes from a place of transcendence. But the basic level is, it doesn't really matter what you eat. It doesn't really matter what the weather is. It doesn't really matter what people think about you. I'm happy, I feel satisfied, and I want to do what I have to do. That's ishtavut. I'll tell you a little story. I told you I'm not going to say stories, but this is a story that comes to mind, so I'll tell it to you. Many years ago, I was at a bris, circumcision. And usually a bris is done very early in the morning. People have to work, and you want to do it in the morning because the mitzvah to do the bris as quick as possible, as early as possible, so you do it early. So let's say the bris is 6 a.m. After the bris, you usually make a suda, a meal. And a proper meal is a meal that also includes meat. Now, most people don't eat meat in the morning. I don't know if you do, but I think most people 7 a.m. do not eat meat. So I was sitting at this bris, and next to me, this older Hasidic Jew sits down. His name is Chaim Tashkent. He sits next to me. And it's 7 a.m. Half the people just woke up. Most people are sipping a coffee in their dreams. And he's all excited and happy. He sits down next to me. And I'm going to describe his morning breakfast. So what he did was like this. There was food on the table, right? It was, what is it called? A buffet. Excellent. But the buffet was on the table where you sit and eat. So it wasn't a buffet. So it's a semi-buffet. I don't know if there's a word for this. Everyone's sitting at tables? Family style. Excellent. So it was a family style bris. On the table, they had, let's say, a piece of sponge cake to the right. To the left, they had some salami because it was meat, so no one's going to eat steak or real meat, so maybe salami someone may taste. Next, it was mustard and ketchup maybe for the salami. Then there was a pickle, maybe some herring. You know what herring is? Like a piece of fish. I don't want to say herring because that's a problem, but there was some other thing. And all this, so he goes to he reaches out for the food, and first he puts down the piece of cake on his plate. Okay, that's pretty normal, right? A piece of cake. Next, the next thing to the left of the piece of cake was ketchup. So he took ketchup and put on his cake. Then to the left of that was a pickle, maybe. Put a pickle, then a piece of salami, and some. The thing was not edible. I mean, you have to be like, semi, I don't know, maybe starving in an island to eat it. And he makes a big blessing with a smile. And I think this guy's not going to eat this, right? With a big smile and with a blessing full of a lot of intention and kavanah, he eats this sandwich. And I'm about to throw up. So I turn to him and say, Reb Chaim, either you're senile, you're not, you're getting a little old, or this is like some type of practice that you do. And basically what he told me was one word, hishtavut. Equanimity. Basically what he was trying to say is, he has to eat, and he has to be healthy. I'm not saying this is a healthy sandwich. But in his mind, he's a pre-war Jew. This was a healthy sandwich. Some sponge cake with salami and ketchup. And that was the sandwich. Basically, what he was doing is, he's saying, I need to eat, I need to be satisfied, and this is what I have to eat. Because that's a level of equanimity. And the truth is that he's more happy than anyone around the room, because everyone is trying to make their perfect sandwich. But at 7 a.m., you can't really make your perfect sandwich. It's not working out. And one person is too tired and one person is too awake, and everyone, not everyone, but he was the only one in the room that was really smiling. Because his way of living, and this is what we're trying to aspire to, his way of living was not because you had a coffee, that's why you feel good. Or not because you ate a good, satisfying meal, that's why you feel good about yourself. Or you feel satisfied. It doesn't matter. If your stomach has enough food in it, you feel good. This is a way to live from here, there, as opposed to from here, inside. So this is the first thing we have to try to understand. How do we do this? And then try to understand a little bit deeper about reactive behaviors. Like we said with the cake in the fridge, why you find yourself immersed and indulged in a piece of cake which you swore off that you won't eat. So to understand this, we're going to try to go through a little bit of Kabbalistic structure and somehow get through some of these details as much as we can. So let's begin like this. Are you familiar with Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal? No? Yes? No? Some of you? Lurianic Kabbalah? Anyways, in the 1500s, there was a great Kabbalist. Kabbalist is a person that's in touch with the mystical tradition of Judaism. And Rabbi Isaac Luria was the greatest Kabbalist of all time, according to many. And he wrote very little. He lived a very short life. He passed away when he was 38. He taught only for 19 months. But from those 19 months, hundreds of books were written on his teachings. His prime disciple was Reb Chaim Vital. Okay? In one of his books, which is called Shari Kedusha, The Gates of Holiness, the Ari means the lion, and it's an acronym for Adonai Rabbeinu Yitzchak, or Laki Rabbeinu Yitzchak, the godly our Rabbi Yitzchak. His name was Isaac. Yitzchak is Isaac. So we're going to use the word Ari. The Ari writes that there are 4 primary elements of creation. I'm sure some of you have heard of this concept, which is a very ancient idea, that there are 4 basic properties. There's the element of earth, water, wind, and fire. Did you ever hear of this concept? Okay. Correct. Some astrology is made up of that. But these are basic 4 properties. Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Afar. Eish is fire, Mayim is water, Ruach is wind, and Afar is earth. Okay, these are the 4 basic properties. Creation, this is what the premise of this text is. Creation, universe, in Hebrew is called Olam. Right? Like tikkun olam, olam. Olam means universe. What is the root of the word olam in Hebrew? The root word of the word olam is he'elem, which means concealment. The definition of physical manifestation is concealment. What is it concealing? It's concealing the oneness, the unity of creation. On the deepest level, there's only one. We see fragmentation. We see time, space, consciousness. Time is separate, space is separate, and consciousness is separate. I'm different from you. This moment is different from the past, and this space is different from the other space. That is on a physical level. Even on a deeper physical level, not even on a metaphysical level, there's no absolute time and there's no absolute space. And the only thing that creates the absoluteness of time and space is consciousness. So the definition of creation, of world, is that it's concealing one and creating division. That is what creation represents. If we feel ourselves separate from another person, or we feel time. Let's talk about time for one moment. If you think about time, what is time? This moment, the way we perceive time, this moment is separate from the past and will evolve into a future. But is there a past and a future? Is there a past? The past is only in our memory. The future is only in our imagination. The present is fleeting. So when is the moment? Is there a moment? Which moment could we say is this moment? The moment I say it's a moment, it's already the past. So what exists? I mean, if we really think about this on a deep level, we can think about this in time, space, and consciousness, that the absoluteness of time, space, and consciousness really means is that there's the only truth is that there's the eternal moment that includes past and present. There's the eternal presence that includes all time, space, and consciousness. That's what we say in the Shema, Hashem, God, is Echad. Echad means one. That's the absolute unity that includes everything. This is the highest definition. Now the question is, so why do we see separation? Why when I look at you, I see you separate from me? Why do when I think about time, I think about a past and a future? What creates the reality of separation? Why are we thinking separation when everything is really unified? The answer is because the world is created from 4 properties, and these properties create the illusion of separation. If you're familiar a little bit with the name of Hashem, the name of God, what is the name of God in Hebrew? We don't pronounce it, but what is the name of God? That's correct. It's a Yud, a Hey, and a Vav, and a Hey. Those are 4 letters. This is the 4 building blocks of creation. And the words Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey spell the word Haya, which is past, Yiyeh, which is future, and Odeh, which is present, which means infinity. Yud K Vav K, the Yud Hey and the Vav Hey, represents infinity that's expressed in past, present, and future. It's also infinity that's expressed in space. I don't want to get too Kabbalistic on you, but if you take the 4 letters, which is Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, and you square them, which is Yud is 10, 10 times 10 is 100, Hey is 5, 5 times 5 is 25, Vav is 6, 6 times 6 is 36, 5 times 5, final Hey, the total number is 186. Yud K Vav K is 186. 186 is the numeric value of the word makom, which is space. So what that really means is that infinity is expressed in past, present, future, space. You're following? This is what creation is. So it's a reality, a perception of separation of time, space, and consciousness, which occurs from the eternal one that's expressed and manifests in time, space, and consciousness. Let's go back a little bit in our lives. So these 4, which is corresponding to the 4 letters of the name of Hashem. We actually have a little bit of map here on the second page. These 4 correspond to the 4 spiritual universes, which we're not going to talk about now. But this is a process of creation. So it begins with emanation, creation, formation, actualization. Every type of creation goes through these 4 processes. If we want to create, if you want to write a piece of music, you want to make a piece of art, you want to create a relationship, it all begins and ends with these 4 processes. It first begins as an emanation, which is an idea, a perception that this is what I want to create. The next process is the actual creation of the idea. You get the easel, you get the paint, you're actually creating. The next process is formatting this image that you want to create. And the final process is actualization. This is the four processes. This also works internally, besides creation externally, but internally. If you're creating something within yourself, an idea, first you have the perception of the idea, that this is what you want to create. Then you understand the details, how you're going to create it. Then you go along and create it, and then you finally actualize it. Is everyone following? Okay. These are the four stages. This also corresponds to the four basic levels of consciousness. There are four levels of consciousness. With God willing, when we talk about reincarnation, maybe later on in the evening, we'll talk about the different levels of consciousness. There are four levels of consciousness. The first level of consciousness is intuiting and intuition. The second level of consciousness is thinking. The third level is feeling. And the fourth level is sensing, which means that there is a spiritual consciousness, an intellectual consciousness, an emotional consciousness, and a physical consciousness, a kinetic consciousness. These are the four levels of consciousness. We said that there are four basic elements. The elements correspond to these four stages. The first element is fire. The second one is wind, water, and earth. Fire, wind, water, and earth. And if you just perceptually, if you just read this image, you'll see that it's becoming more rarefied. It's becoming more concrete, right? So fire has less properties, wind has more properties, water has more property, and finally earth has physical properties that you can touch and is tangible. Of course, you can touch also water and wind and fire because all the elements are interconnected, but that's for another discussion. But this is we're understanding the flow. These, in turn, correspond to four basic problems. And this is what we have to deal with. According to the Ari, the reason why we're not all prophets, is anyone a prophet here? But you don't have to advertise. Maybe someone is. But the reason why we're not all prophets, which means the reason why, if there is no time, space, and consciousness, how come we don't perceive the entire history of the past and the future at this present moment? Why don't we? If there is no time, why don't we perceive that there is no time? If there's no separation of consciousness, why don't we perceive the separation of consciousness? If there's no separation of space, why don't we observe everything that's occurring in space and all around the universe? Why don't we receive that? And why do certain people, at certain moments, maybe get a glimpse into a higher consciousness, which maybe they have an intuition about something that's going to happen in the future? Why don't we see it at all times, and why possibly do we see it at some times? And the answer is because there are four elements that correspond to four internal issues, that these are considered the concealments that don't allow us to have the transparency to go beyond time and space and consciousness. These are the four basic issues that we have to deal with in life, according to the Rabbi. You're following? Four basic issues. Everything else is commentary. The first issue that we have to deal with is anger. Anger, arrogance, it's all part of the same element. And this is a negativity that we're all born with, an element that we're all born with. We're prone to anger, we're prone to, some people less, some people more, we're prone to feel arrogance. And this is an issue that we have to deal with. The second issue, which corresponds to the element of fire. The second issue is corresponding to the element of wind, is empty words. What does empty words mean? Empty words is not lashon hara. It's not negative words. It's not speaking ill about somebody else. It's actually speaking nothing. Do you know what it means to speak nothing? Some people talk, I don't want to say, but there's a conversation that you don't say anything. No one's saying anything. I think the biggest example of empty words in my life is I was once driving with someone in a car, and he turned on a sports station. I don't know if you ever listened to a sports station on the radio. The man spoke for an hour and said the same thing. Maybe every sports guy, maybe every commentary on the radio or television does the same thing, but I'm not familiar, and I don't really watch that much. But the guy said one thing, basically saying that the Yankees are better than the Mets. But he said this for an hour. But he didn't go into bigger details. But the Yankees are better because the Mets are not worse. The Mets are worse, but the Yankees are better. The Yankees are better, always better, but they're better. And then the other caller calls up and says, the Yankees, yes, the Yankees are better. The guy just said nothing. I just for 1 hour. Now, of course, it's his parnasa. I understand. It's his livelihood. And he should be well and be happy, and he should, everything should be well with him. But it's unbelievable that a person could sit and say nothing for an hour. This is empty words. It's pitput dvarim, just like talking, chirping. What? Chirping like a bird. I don't know, maybe birds do talk. Who knows? Could be they probably sometimes say more intelligent things than humans. But this is empty words, talking. This is another issue that we have to deal with. Part of this empty words conversation is the scatteredness of our words. That we're incoherent. That, sometimes you start a conversation with one person and you go from one topic to the next topic and you're just jumping around. You're familiar with this problem? You go from one thing to the next. Forget of it. Let's think about this on a more deeper level. Did you ever try to think for 5 minutes about something? No, I'm not talking about for an hour. I'm talking about for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, for 30 seconds. Concentrate on this blank white wall. 30 seconds. Could you do it? No one could do it. You know what's going to happen? Within 2 seconds, probably, a little voices will come in and say, why am I thinking about this wall? And then another voice is going to say, look at the pattern behind the wall. And the other one is going to say, look at the lights. And within 30 seconds, your mind is completely adrift somewhere in the Bahamas on a beach. This is what happens. This is called, there's a word for this. It's interesting, because in the East, the word for this is called monkey mind. It's like, I don't know what they have. Monkey mind. Like a monkey jumps around from one thing to the next. It's a monkey mind. But the Hasidic masters, you see, in the East, they lived, let's say, in Thailand. Yeah? So there are monkeys jumping around in Thailand. So they thought about monkeys. But in Russia and the Ukraine, there are no monkeys. At least not jumping around the streets. What did they see? What did they see? What did the average man see every day? Which animal? A horse. Correct. So the Hasidic masters didn't call it monkey mind, they called it machshavas hasus. Horse thoughts. Horse thoughts, monkey mind, it's the same idea. You walk down the street, an alarm goes on, you think about the alarm. You see a guy, you think about the guy's nose. The nose reminds you of your friend. The friend reminds you of something else you did. It reminds you of your lunch. The lunch reminds you of your supper. And the next thing you're thinking about, you're back on the beach in Aruba. But you're just trying to think for 5 minutes straight. We can't have a coherent thought. And of course, then we wonder why our words are not coherent and why our actions are all scattered, because we have a scattered mind, scattered words, scattered actions. So the next big klipa, you know what the word klipa means? Klipa means concealment. The thing that is covering over of our soul potential, of our true potential, of being truly who we are, is this scatteredness, this emptiness, this wind-like quality that we're jumping all over the place. Something that has to be dealt with. The third element, internal element that we have to deal with, is insatiability. Again, we all know what this means. Insatiability means, as it sounds, you want something, you get it, you want it more. You think that if you're going to buy, I don't have this problem, but there's some people in this world that have this problem. Not because I'm a very spiritual person, because I don't have too many pairs of shoes. But some people feel if they're going to buy this pair of shoes, this is going to bring them satisfaction. I only need this last pair of shoes for the season I'm talking about, not forever. This last season, it's the summer season, I need to get 13 pairs of shoes for the summer. In case it's cold, it's hot, I have to hike, not hike. There's a whole list of things that have to be done. And you think if I get this last pair of shoes, I'm happy. What happens? The next morning you wake up and you say, there's one other pair of shoes that I have to get. And let's say you say, by 40 I want to make $1 million. 40 comes, you make $1 million, you think you're happy? because then you say by 45 I need to make 2. And there's an emptiness that we're trying to fill. And the emptiness we're trying to fill with objects. And the more we put the objects into the emptiness, it doesn't help. There's something inherently wrong in this equation. We feel empty, an emotional or psychological or spiritual or physical emptiness. And we feel the need that this thing is going to fill this hole. But the problem is the more things that fill this hole, the more we want it. And that emptiness is never filled. So we have to deal with that issue as well. That's called insatiability. It could be good, it could be bad. It could be good. On a spiritual level, if you're insatiable, and you say, I want to learn more, and I want to grow more, on a spiritual level, it's good. But it's a paradoxical thing spiritually. I don't want to get into it, but spiritually, satisfaction occurs in the attainment of the quality. It's not an object. It's not like trying to fill a spiritual hole with a Band-Aid or fix a spiritual wound with a Band-Aid. You're actually filling it with its right kind. And therefore, there could be satisfaction on a spiritual level, but of course, there has to be also insatiability, that you always want more. That's a paradox. So hopefully we're going to get to this place where we're going to talk about the perfect self versus the imperfect self, and these two images of self, and we have to deal with them. The next level, or the next element, is depression. And depression, I don't mean clinical depression. God forbid if a person is clinically depressed, they have to go take some medication. We're talking about a person that's down and feels, the Monday morning blues. It gets you down, the weather's bad, whatever. You have to deal with this issue, because if you're depressed and you don't have a cheshek anymore, you don't have a desire, that's the most terrible thing. You lose courage, you lose everything. So we have to make sure that we deal with these 4 issues in order to evolve. Now, they're corresponding. It goes on the top. You see, earth is depression, water is insatiability, wind is empty words, and fire is anger. Okay, so now let's get to some of the practices of really transforming ourselves. Remember, we talked about the problem and the tension between these 2 parts of self. The parts of self, the rational self that says, this is what I want to do, and it chooses, and it says this is the right thing for me to do, versus some subconscious part of myself that constantly pushes me to do different things in different directions. How do we untrain ourselves? How do we make sure that our subconscious, not our conscious, our subconscious reactive behavior is consistent with the principles and the ideas that we learn? That when we talk about anger, it doesn't necessarily remain information, but it becomes transformational. How do we make sure that what we understand, this is what we should be doing, actually becomes the way we do it? And it becomes instinct. So we're going to divide this into 4, because we're doing everything in 4, we're going to divide this into 4 stages of Jewish thought in the last 1,000 years. We're not going to go before that. We'll take the last 1,000-year history and divide them into 4 stages and understand them, what they mean, how they work. And the 4 stages will begin from what is called classic Musar. Classic Musar begins, the first classic book of Musar. Musar means ethical behavior. The first text that was written is in the 10th century, in the early 11th century, by Rabbi Ibn Pekuda, and the book is called Chovat HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart. Correct. That's the first book of classic Musar. If you're familiar a little bit with Jewish history, there's the conclusion of the Talmud around the year 5 Common Era, and then 500-year period is the Golden period, and Rabbanan Sevraya, and then is the beginning of the Rishonim, the beginning of the early ones, and that's the beginning of, we'll take this period, the beginning of Jewish philosophy. So we're going to focus on 4 perspectives, of 4 avenues, and we're going to see how each one can actually enhance and help us in our own life. The first perspective will be from classic Musar. Classic Musar begins, like I said, in the 10th century, and it moves till about the 1700s, the 18th century. That's classic Musar. Also, we're going to focus a little bit on classic Kabbalah. Classic Kabbalah, if you're familiar a little with Jewish history, from about the 1200s, the late 1200s, there became a very big divide in Jewish theology or philosophy. There was the philosophers on one hand, like Maimonides, Gershonites, Crescus, if you're familiar with some of these names. That was on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you had the Zohar, Nachmanides, Rabbeinu Bechai, and all the students of the Ramban. These are the two groups. So one is philosophers, and one is the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists. Classic Kabbalah. We're going to fast forward Classic Kabbalah until the early 1700s, which is with the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, year 1698, the birth of the Baal Shem. The Baal Shem Tov begins the Hasidic movement. Chabad is part of the Hasidic movement, and Hasidic movement is a new approach. And that's ultimately what we're going to try to get to this understanding. The Baal Shem Tov's understanding of how we deal with issues and how do we really transform ourselves and how do we make ourselves live from the inside out. Right? This is the Baal Shem Tov. About 100 years later, there was another movement which is called the Musar movement that arose in Lithuania and Vilna, which deals with interesting ideas, and a lot of things that predates Freud is found in the Musar movement in the 1800s. If we have time, we'll discuss some of these ideas that Freud spoke about later, which is the subconscious, and in Yiddish it's called the Dunkle Seite, which is the dark side, but not the dark side, if you're familiar with like Jungian psychology, not the dark side like Jung, but the dark side means the deeper consciousness. That there's the lighter side of self, which is your conscious self, and the darker part of self, which is the self that is really ingrained deeply. That's what, like we said, the piece of cake, that you keep on going back to it. Okay, let's try to do this quickly because we have 15 minutes. All right, no hostages. Let's start. Let's see how far we get, but this is important. So we have these four interpretations. Let's try to understand them. The first, and here there's an overlap between classic Musar and classic Kabbalah, but we're going to try to divide them to understand their fine differences. Classic Musar will say like this, and this is a very big statement that's repeated constantly, that Hergel nasa teva sheni. Hergel nasa teva sheni, which means repetitive behavior becomes second nature. This is one statement. Then the next statement is Achar hamaisa halev nimshechas. Acharei hamaseh halev nimshechas. After actions, the heart follows. That your heart follows actions, not in reverse. We normally think we have an emotion, and then we act. And in classic Kabbalah, classic Musar, which was say before the 1700s, there was a new understanding, which is, no, it actually works the other way around, that the heart will follow the action. Okay, let's understand what this means. You're trying to stay away from a certain pattern of behavior that's very deeply ingrained in your subconscious, that when you're not consciously aware about the choice that you're making, your subconscious reacts, and therefore you act negatively. Let's say it's a negative thing. Okay. We'll use the example of cake, because that's the example. So, like this. Every day, think about your life and say, okay, when do I eat cake? I'm not asking a question. Thinking about the issue, when do I eat cake? Okay, it could be after a meal. I mean, it could be any time. But there's certain patterns that you find. Maybe by breakfast, maybe by supper, maybe there's a certain time when I go out. There's certain times in my life that I go to a bakery and there's certain things that happen because of that I end up eating a piece of cake. Okay. Right? This is no rocket science. This is basically the way it works, right? There's times. What you have to do now, according to classic Musar would be, you have to change your pattern of behavior. Now, it doesn't mean don't think about it. Don't start saying, okay, I don't like cake, and cake is terrible for me, and it's not good for me, and the sugar and all that. Don't do that. Don't think about the internal reality of yourself. Don't think about the emotional attachment or detachment that you have. Just pretend it's just a physical action. I eat it, and now what I'm going to do, I'm going to exchange this action with another action. This is going to be my response. Normally, when I get angry, I scream. From now on, forget about that anger is a terrible thing. I don't even talk about that. From now on, every time I get angry, I pinch myself. That's what I do. That's the first thing that I do. What that does is, over time, and this is not a magic pill, it doesn't happen overnight. Over time, repetitive behavior becomes your second nature. Everything becomes lodged in your subconscious. It's just a matter of time. If you give up right away and you say, I'm going to do this. Oh, I can't do this because I'm a hypocrite, so forget it. You're never going to grow. But if you say, I'm trying to do this thing, it's not working out, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to find a new set of responses. What's my new set of responses? My new set of responses, instead of acting this way when this situation comes up, I'm going to act this way. I may feel angry, and I may feel a desire to have cake. I'm not changing my feeling. I'm not changing my understanding. I'm just changing the physical activity. Instead of doing X, I'm doing Y. You're following? It's very simple. What happens now, over a period of time, this becomes your second nature. And then, when you're going to be challenged in a case of, let's say, of anger, and anger is going to come up, your instinctive, reactive behavior will be to pinch yourself and not to scream. Again, this doesn't happen overnight, and I'm not saying to pinch yourself. I'm just giving you an example, to do something. Take a run. I start jogging every time I feel angry. But do it every single time you get angry. It has to be absolute. You have to believe in the absoluteness of this statement, that it's wrong, and you have to believe and continuously to practice, that's perseverance, in the absoluteness of the practice. I constantly do this. Now, it may seem trite, it may seem silly and nonsensical. That's okay. You're just trying to lodge into your subconscious a new pattern of behavior. And the only way to do that is not to go to lectures. If you're dealing with anger, don't go to anger management lectures. It's not going to help. Most people, everyone's angry in the anger management lecture, so it's not really helping. It's just repetitive, obsessive, compulsive behavior of repeating itself again, going over and over again. Don't do this. Don't even read books about anger. Just choose to find another response and stick to it. Once, twice, 3 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. This becomes your response. This will become your instinct. I think we'll have to take questions later because I just want to get through a little bit. This will become your instinctive, reactive behavior. This is in part 1. Part of this process is that over time, halev nimsheches acher hamaisim, the heart will be transformed according to your actions. Which means, when we do things over and over and over enough, not only does it become our reactive way of doing things, but it actually transforms the doer. If you give every single day charity, every single day and according to the Shalah, according to other great sages, you have to do this every day. Every day, they can't pass a day that you didn't do a chesed, a kindness to someone else. If you do a goodness, a kindness, a charitable act every single day, now, most of the days you feel like, okay, I'm not really feeling anything. I don't really feel sympathy or empathy for this person, whatever, but I'm doing it. Eventually, you will become a transformed person. And the more actions you do, this is what the Tanya writes, the more actions you do, the more it becomes ingrained and the more you become transformed. So there's value in an action, a positive action, whether you understand that it's right or whether you feel like your heart is open. There are different ways of thinking about it. What is the most important act of charity? Is it the act of the giving of the charity? Or is it an act of me reaching a place of being sympathetic to the other person? And the answer is, It'll happen automatically. Do the act, and automatically you'll start feeling sympathy for enough people. But you have to do it once, twice, 3 times, 1,000 times. So the action becomes your reactive behavior, and the action transforms you in a way that you become the charitable person. You become the person that has control of yourself. This is the classic understanding. That's perspective number 1. Perspective number 2 is classic Kabbalah. Classic Kabbalah would be the Kabbalah up until the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. So we're going to include the Zohar and the Ari in classic Kabbalah. If you're familiar a little with classic Kabbalah, if you ever took a Kabbalah class and read the Zohar, I don't know if you did, if you didn't, but I'm sure everyone heard something about Kabbalah. You open up a Zohar, there's a lot of strange imagery in the Zohar. Demonology and creatures and spirits. There's a lot of what we would call negative imagery. And I have to talk about this, even though we're going to see later the Baal Shem Tov tries to tame this perspective and try to transform it. But I just want to just understand the historical narrative here. Classic Kabbalah says that if you really want to change, imagine, because remember, we talked about the tension between the word and the image. Right? The conflict between the word and the image. I understand that's what I should be doing, but my image tells me something else. My image tells me that this piece of cake will be good for me. The transformation of imageries, it's a very important thing. I just look very quickly. The word nachash, which is snake in Hebrew, also means in the Torah superstition. And according to the Sephorah, if you look in the biblical narrative with Adam and Eve, there's a snake. What is this snake? What's this character? What's this character? He has a voice and he talks and he convinces people to do things. What is this? And the answer is this is fantasy. There's going to be a difference, and we have to understand this. It's a very important distinction. There's a difference between fantasy and creative imagination. Fantasy is false imagination. And why do I say false? If you, I don't want to say you, everybody is affected by our senses. If you close your eyes, honestly, you don't have to tell me this. If you close your eyes for one slight second and imagine what is the true definition of a happy person. When you imagine yourself happy, how do you see yourself? It's guaranteed. Now, in this room, everyone is great tzaddikim, everyone's holy people. It's not going to happen here. But if the average people, if you ask in the street, what is your image of perfect happiness? I guarantee you that it's a beer commercial if you're 18. If you're 60, it probably is a Viagra commercial. It depends really on your age. Why? Because we are affected by the images that we see. So when you think about what is the definition of like, I arrived, I'm happy, I'm content with my life, it's probably going to be some type of commercial. And if it's not one commercial, it's a hodgepodge of billions of commercials, hopefully that you didn't watch, but somehow subliminally entered into your consciousness, of commercials. You just walk down the street, you're bombarded with advertisement. This is going to make you happy. This is going to make you satisfied. This is going to give you success, right? All that stimula, external stimula, creates the fantasy. This is what the Nachash did. This is what the snake did. The snake represents the external imposing itself on the internal. Adam says, I don't want to eat from the tree of knowledge. Eve says, I don't want to eat from the tree of knowledge. All of a sudden, the snake comes. Who's the snake? The snake is the outside. It's not an internal voice. It's the outside voice. The outside voice that says, this is good for you, this is good for you, that's good for you. What is the world of fantasy? The world of fantasy is when our definitions of happiness, definition of self, is not created from the inside out, it's created from the outside in. What is the transformation of the nachash, of the snake? The word nachash has the same numeric value of the word Mashiach. Because on the deepest level, we have to be able to transform our fantasy into positive imagination. And when we can do that collectively, then we live in a Mashiach place, in a Mashiach consciousness. And we collectively bring in that era. In other words, because we're effective from the outside in, the transformation of that consciousness is to create it from the inside out. If you break history into 3 points, according to some deeper readings of the Torah, history can be divided into three stages. The first stage of history is told the destructions of the temple, which we just commemorated with the 9th of Av. The second stage of history is from the destruction of the temple, about 1900 years, till the present moment. The next stage of history is the future. There are 3 capacities in the human being. There's action, words, and thoughts. First stage of human history is the world of action. Let's say we did something wrong in the times of the temple. What did you do in the times of the temple if you did something wrong? What did you do? You went to the temple and brought an actual physical action. The world of action. Actions atoning. Like classical Kabbalah. You're doing a behavior. You're doing something in the physical. The second stage in history is after the destruction of the temple, the sages tell us that tefillah b'makom karbanos tiknum. That prayer comes in the place of the offerings. It's the world of speech. The future is the world of thought. We can change our actions, we can change our words, but so long as we don't change our thoughts, nothing will happen. Of course, Mashiach should come instantaneously, but if we want to work on it, it's not just that we don't longer do one thing or do the other thing. It's not just that we say certain things and we stop saying other things. We have to change the way we think, the way we dream, the way our subconscious thinks. And that's through imagery. Number 3, quickly. We're going to do this quickly. So number 2 is to attach an idea to an image. But the idea to the image is to use negative imagery. Simply like that. Imagine a piece of cake. This is what the Zohar will use. It doesn't use this description. But it says, imagine this piece of cake, rotten. I don't want to get... But imagine, and then imagine it rotten in your stomach. So it no longer just becomes a concept, but the concept is, it's gross. You actually see the image in front of you. You can do this with anger as well. Instead of saying, okay, I'm not going to act angry, I'm going to act angry, you attach the idea, what you're studying, what you're learning about. Say, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to create. You say, you know what happens when I become angry? I know what happens, look what happened. And I have this whole visual, this whole film in my mind, exactly what happens when I become angry. So therefore, the teaching, now, because it becomes attached to an image, can supplement the negative image. The other responsive behavior, because of that image, now becomes supplemented by the other image, which is also negative, right? It's a negative image, but at least that will override the negative response and force a positive response. This is a complicated idea, and we'll see very quickly that the Baal Shem Tov would say, instead of focusing on the negative, focus on the positive. Don't focus how the cake is rotten, but focus how you feel good after you don't eat cake. If you had dinner and you don't eat cake, you feel actually better than when you do. So just keep on having that image in your mind. But that's 2 ways how we can look at it. The third, very quickly, is the path of contemporary Musar. Contemporary Musar, which I said is a little bit, comes before Freud, which is a very interesting study on its own, but he talks about the light side of self and the dark part of self. The light part of self is your conscious, the dark part of self is your subconscious. The way to transform yourself is to choose a particular teaching. Let's say you want to deal with anger, okay? And you understand that anger is bad. And you did go to the anger management class, and there were a few highlights that the lecturer said that were actually very interesting. Or you read a little bit the Talmud, you read the Maimonides, you read, something terrible, that anger is like idol worship. And okay, you understand that. It's self-serving. Okay. Take that statement, and you know the truth of the statement. Absolutely, 100% on a rational self, you completely believe in the statement. The problem is, like we said, that your reactive behavior will be different. So what do you do now? This path of Musar says, take the statement and put it to words. Make it a song. Let's say the statement says, Kol hakoyes ki lo yavdu edazar. If you become angry, it's like you're an idol worshiper. Okay, it's not a positive statement, but it's a negative statement. Take that statement and constantly chant it to yourself over and over again. Why? Because music and repetitive, like behavior, but repetitive sound has a quicker way to enter into your subconscious than a rational thought. Because the rational thought will constantly be repressed from your subconscious because it has a different understanding. But when you put something to a song, or you're chanting it with a lot of vigor and excitement, and you're putting that idea to sound, the sound will slowly penetrate with the message. As opposed to just using the message on its own, put the message to sound. So just like earlier we said put the message to an image, we're now putting the message to a sound. Because imagery, sound, these are all subliminal. And we want to get to that place where the subliminal actually has an effect on us. So when you put it to sound, we can penetrate deeper into our subconscious, and therefore our reactions, when it comes to a situation of anger, that tune will play in your subconscious, and therefore you're going to act accordingly.
It's like jingles.
Could be, but it's you can do it any type of song. I mean, whatever, you can do a slow song, fast song, whatever, putting the words to a tune. Again, I wish I had enough time to explain this in detail exactly how this works, but this is the concept. I just want to get to the concept. The fourth concept is the path of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, his big idea is that everything has to be about inclusion, about love and acceptance, and it's not about beating yourself up. We did that enough, and now let's try to reach a level of internal harmony. Okay, that's a very nice statement, but what do we do? So there's in Musar it says your negative inclinations, these proclivities towards the negative is like a thief. So Musar says if you want to get the thief out of your house, you have to throw him out of the house. Right? You fight it. You say you're a terrible person. Get out of my house. You don't actually say that to someone that's coming to rob your home, but your reaction is basically suggesting, right? When you come and you pick up a pot or pan and you're chasing the guy out of the house, that's a thief. Your reaction is you're doing something terrible and you don't belong in my house. Okay. The Baal Shem Tov says that if you do that, you actually don't gain anything. Why? And I'm talking about internally, I'm not talking about the thief. Because what happens now is that the thief remains a thief. The thief remains a thief. And instead of robbing your home, we'll go to the next home. And maybe tomorrow we'll come back to your home. So you didn't really gain. By pushing something aside, you're not really transforming it. By just throwing it out, you're not really transforming it. So there's a part of ourselves that we push aside. Okay, I'm not going to have this thought. I'm supposed to be thinking positive thoughts. This negative thought comes into my mind. I'm going to push it aside. It's not going to help. Okay, I push it aside for 5 minutes, but it's going to come back tomorrow. And if you ever practice any form of meditation, you should know this, that if you're having some quiet time with yourself and you're trying to empty your mind and a thought comes into your mind, bless you, a thought comes into your mind and you try to push it away, that's the last thing you want to do. Because the moment you push it away, it starts banging and pushing itself into you. Because that's the thought that's most important to you at this present moment. So the Baal Shem Tov says, don't ignore the thought. Acknowledge it. It's probably something really troubling you. If that's the thought that's coming up, it's because it's something emotionally, physically, something that has to be addressed. Internally, the Baal Shem Tov says, if the thief comes to your house, don't push him aside. Sit the thief down. I don't think we can actually do this. But sit the guy down and tell him, what are you doing? This is not a good way to make a living. And try to convince the thief not to be a thief any longer. This is what the Baal Shem Tov says. In other words, try to explain yourself how this thing is no longer good for you. Not just to push it aside, okay, I have this reactive behavior, I'm not going to do it any longer. But try to understand it yourself, why this behavior is not good for you. And instead of using negative imagery, use positive imagery. Imagine yourself when you don't lose your cool and you don't become angry and you remain composed. You're happy and everyone else is happy. And your life seems much better. Now imagine yourself that you're angry and scary. You're scary and everyone's scared of you. And relationships break. So visualize it. Put it to an image. And anytime you want to think about something negative to push aside, instead of thinking the negative ramifications, on a level of the negative imagery, try to imagine the positive effects of this thing, of this behavior of yours. So it's either repetitive behavior, negative imagery, putting it to sound, and positive imagery. And these are some of the ways that we can start really transforming ourselves and living from the inside out. Okay.